Hello everyone, we are on chapter 7 and we are on the last paragraph, paragraph 37. Woohoo! So let's get started. The form which the metaphysical realist nowadays gives to his things in themselves is obtained by inductive inferences. Through considerations of the process of knowledge, he is convinced of the existence of an objectively real world continuum over and above the subjective world continuum, which we know through percepts and concepts. The nature of this reality he thinks he can determine by inductive inferences from his percepts. So we have 37 summarized as follows. The metaphysical realist is convinced of the existence of an objectively real world continuum over and above the subjective world continuum, which we know through percepts and concepts. What Steiner is basically saying, I think if he had added the word that this whole theory of how these metaphysical realists are formulating their theory of knowledge, it's very redundant. I mean, that is what is the bottom line with this theory, and I think he should have just thrown that word in there because it would maybe make things a little easier to understand. But to explain that paragraph, the metaphysical realists, their process of knowledge uses inductive inference. And inductive inference isn't necessarily a bad thing, but they're not really using it in a good way because they believe in a subjective reality, but they use inductive inference to know the objective reality. And it's redundant because they believe that there's this whole other world that's objective behind what they perceive. And it's like, well, Steiner is arguing, well, you know, what's subjective is perhaps your point of how you acquire your percept or whatever, but it's concepts that are objective, although he's mentioned before concepts are beyond subjectivity and objectivity, those terms. But I mean, to say that you have to seek for a world that's objective, you know, behind this subjective world that you're experiencing is false, because now they're formulating all these theories and whatnot, and it's just redundant because they're seeking this world that isn't really there. And so, as you can imagine, it's not very secure as a foundation if you're going to have a theory of knowledge. If you're going to acquire knowledge of the world, it will fall apart if all you're doing is inferring things and believing that what you're perceiving is not the real world. You're believing that there is a world beyond that is objective, that is the reality. And so hopefully you can start to see sort of the flaw in metaphysics in this paragraph. So to sum up chapter 7, he's just talking about the various theories of knowledge and just pointing out how, because they're very flawed theories, they lead to limits in knowledge because they're based on faulty premises. For Steiner, his philosophy doesn't lead to knowledge. It doesn't lead to any limits in knowledge because he said earlier, you know, what we do not know today, you know, maybe we can figure it out eventually. You know, that's very optimistic. His simple theory that, you know, knowledge is based on percepts and concepts, you know, it doesn't lead to limits in knowledge because maybe eventually you'll find the right percept that can help you find the right concept, which helps you advance further on. So all these other theories of knowledge lead to limitations, and they create these barriers that are actually just faulty concepts about knowledge and what is knowledge and how we know the world. So that's what he's basically talks about in this whole chapter. Okay, so in this edition, I'm just going to talk about the main points here. He says, he starts off by talking about certain ideas that he finds disturbing in science. specifically one that leads to the view that the range of man's perceptual world is determined by the range of his senses, and humans would be confronted by a very different world if he had additional or different senses. I'm just going to point out main quotes that he says in this. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. He continues to say that whatever senses man might possibly have, not one would give him reality if his thinking did not permeate with concepts whatever he perceived. What causes us to inquire into our relationship to the world is not the fanciful pictures of how different the world would appear to other than human senses, but the realization that every percept gives us only a part of the reality concealed within it. In other words, that it directs us away from its inherent reality. And that's a very important point, because percepts, again, as he kept saying, percepts is just one half of the reality, and it's concepts as well that gives us knowledge. Real knowledge is the combination of percept and concept. If you just have percepts, and that's you need the concepts, and yes, your percepts. He further continues on. He says an increase or modification of human senses would yield a different picture and be more enriching, but real knowledge is based on the combination of concept and percept. Deepening of knowledge depends on the powers of intuition which express themselves in thinking. So again, he's just pointing out senses, what we're perceiving, what science is pointing out in their observations of senses. That's not enough. It's good, if we are able to perceive more, but that alone is not going to give us real knowledge, because intuition will help us get the concepts and will help us to learn about things, and that is what is knowledge. He says also, just before that quote, because I just kind of skipped forward because the whole thread was about senses, he says in the field of physics, they study things such as the electric and magnetic force. These are not normally perceived by humans, but he is pointing out that they are still classified as percepts because we can observe them using other tools. So a percept isn't, as he continues to mention, a percept isn't just limited to what we can perceive with our senses. If we create tools like microscopes and whatnot to perceive things that are very minute, that is still an object of observation. I really want you to drill in your head that a percept is an object of observation. So it's not just what you can sense with your senses. And he does say that, I have it here. Yes, he says in another paragraph, percept is everything that approaches man through the senses or through the spirit, before it has been grasped by the actively elaborated concepts, that is, thinking. External sense percept is a special instance of a percept, but percept is not limited to just this example. So he wants the reader to take a broad view of this term percept, and in the introduction where he lists all his terms, it's very specific that a percept is an object of observation. So that's why you need to drill it into your head what that means, because that is a much more encompassing idea of what a percept is. A percept isn't just that. So it's a more broad term. That's also what he talks about in this edition. He wants the reader to understand his use of the word percept is that it is a broad term, and that we cannot understand his theory if we think of percepts as just limited to external sense objects. I just mentioned that again, he wants people to get it's a broad term. And finally, he talks about somebody commented on his expression in chapter 6 where he says the mental picture is an individualized concepts is an individualized concept, excuse me, and this person said it was an unusual use of words. So basically Steiner just points out at the end to stop whining about my choice of words, because that's true. A mental picture is an individualized concept. So again, he just wants the reader, you know, I'm using these terms, this is how it might be a little unusual, this is what I mean, this is the term, you know, try and follow my language of what I mean when I talk about these things. So that's what he's basically saying at the end there. So that's chapter 7. That's the addition. The next chapter is really short and sweet, so we'll have fun with that one. So I look forward to seeing you all again next time. Bye.